Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Minister Rankin, distinguished panel members, and fellow colleagues. Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning on this very special day, recognizing the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And thank you for attending the lecture panel discussion entitled Unpacking Systemic Racism, Our Realities and Responsibilities. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional Mi'kmaq lands of the Mi'kmahi, the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And I also want to thank Sobaz Benjamin from Drummers from Home for starting the day off in a very nice and uplifting beat. So it's always nice to hear the drums first thing in the morning. It's a call to action, it's the heartbeat, and we thank you for always accommodating us, Sobaz. So I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Tracy Thomas, and I'm with African Nova Scotian Affairs. And together with the Human Rights Commission, we've partnered together to host this day and organize this day for the International Day of Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And it's a very important day of remembrance. So at this time, I'd like to welcome the Honorable Ian Rankin, Minister of Lands and Forestries, to say a few words on behalf of Minister Tony Ince, Minister of African Nova Scotian Affairs, and the Public Service Commission.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see all of you out here for an important discussion. And I know Ariel, but I haven't met the other panel members until today, but I've seen their qualifications, and I'm sure you're going to have a lively, informative discussion. I'd like to begin that we are all on traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I'm pleased to join you as we come together to recognize the United Nations International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. I'm honored to say a few words on behalf of my friend and colleague Tony Ince, Minister of African Nova Scotia Affairs and Minister of the Public Service Commission. Today we are joining people from around the world to take a stand against systemic racism, discrimination, prejudice, and related intolerance, which unfortunately is still a reality in many of our Nova Scotian communities. We must continue to address the issues of race. We must be willing to have difficult conversations, and we must hear each other's voices and embody a willingness to change. Nova Scotians deserve to live in a province where all individuals are treated with dignity, equality, and respect. As an elected official, I welcome and encourage a more diverse workplace in both the public and private sectors. Our government is fully committed to a healthy, safe, and supportive workplace where all individuals are treated with respect and dignity. We are undertaking initiatives to address systemic racism and discrimination that many have faced for generations. For example, we implemented the Count Yourself In, a workforce census that gathers detailed data to help provide a greater understanding of what we look like as a workforce. The data is used for diversity, inclusion, and employment equity planning. Hiring managers can now use diverse hiring panels to remove systemic barriers in the recruitment and selection process. We have created designated positions which are open only to employment equity candidates. We are currently working to improve this process as well. We now have 6 employee networks: the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Intersex Network, African Canadian Women in the Public Service, GovernX, the Nova Scotia Disability Network, the First Nation Network, and the Immigrant Newcomer Network. We also have several departmental diversity committees and a diversity roundtable, a forum for representatives who work to advance diversity, cultural competence, social equity, and employment equity. I'm also proud that we, once again, our public service received a recognition as one of Canada's best diversity employers for 2019. And we are not stopping here. Our government will continue this work for years to come. There is more work to do. In closing, Nova Scotians must acknowledge and recognize the existence of racism and how it still impacts our communities. We must put aside our differences and work together to eliminate systemic racism, intolerance, and discrimination from our lives. Together, we can make a positive difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Rankin. So before I introduce the moderator to begin the panel discussion, I'd like to share a little background on the importance of the day. So on March 21st, 1960, that's 59 years ago, on this exact day, the Sharpeville massacre happened in South Africa. This is when police opened fire and killed 69 people at a peaceful demonstration against apartheid, the pass laws. So the pass laws were an internal passport system designed to control the movement of black people. So pass laws required that black people had to carry identifying documents with them at all times. So similar to our passports that we carry when we travel to different countries and get stamped to get in. So this is what people in South Africa had to carry with them every day to go to walk about the countryside. And they had black people, yes. Didn't I say that? Oh, no? Okay, yeah, black people, in case there was any mistake. And so they had, if they wanted to enter, then they had to show, if they wanted to enter a different town, they had to show their identification. And these identifying documents had to contain stamps providing official proof that that person in question had permission to be in that town at that particular time. So as you can imagine, this restrictive law was a dominant feature in South Africa's apartheid system, which ended in 1986. So today, March 21st, commemorates the lives that have been lost to the fight for democracy and human rights in South Africa during the apartheid regime. And by proclaiming the day in 1966, the United Nations Assembly called on the international community to increase its efforts in eliminating all forms of racial discrimination. Fast forward to today, and this year, 2019, marks the 5th year of the International Decade for People of African Descent, as declared by the UN. And this decade also recognizes that people of African descent represent a distinct group whose human rights must be protected. So with that as a little bit of a backdrop, I encourage you, that's just a very, very, very high level of what the day is. I encourage you to go to the UN's website to read up more about the day, and so you can learn a little bit more about why this conversation is so important. And I'm glad that the panelists here are actually here to share a little bit of insight onto how it relates to today. And so with that as a context and a backdrop, we move into the panel, Unpacking Systemic Racism, Our Realities and Responsibilities. So it's our aim that this discussion will serve as a learning and sharing opportunity to provide a better understanding of what systemic racism is, how racialized people in communities are impacted by it, and how we can all mitigate systemic racism through our provincial government roles. So let's begin the conversation. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Kesa Monroe, who will moderate the panel. So a little bit about Kesa. Dr. Monroe is a zealous, community-oriented individual who practices an Afrocentric approach to leadership. Living on her philosophy that leadership and lifelong learning go hand in hand, Kesa attained a Bachelor of Arts degree in English with honors and a Master of Arts degree in English from Acadia, as well as a Master of Education in Lifelong Learning with the focus of Afrocentric leadership at Mount St. Vincent University, graduating in 2008 as a valedictorian. In May 2018, Kesa was the first person of African descent to graduate from the Inter-University Doctoral of Education Studies program, with Mount St. Vincent University being her degree-granting institution. Her doctoral dissertation explored the role of spirituality as an anti-oppressive agent in the formal education of African Nova Scotian learners. Having been actively involved in African Nova Scotian communities through various initiatives involving seniors, women, youth, and adults of all ages, Kesa is passionate about work that fosters the creation of opportunities for individuals and communities to develop, prosper, and attain their fullest potential. Kesa is currently employed as the Manager of Race Relations, Equity, and Inclusion with the Nova Scotia Human Rights. I welcome Kesa.
Thank you very much, Tracy, and good morning to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us today. I would also like to acknowledge that we are in Mi'kmaq territory and just invite us to think about what that means. What does it mean to truly be exercising reconciliation? What does that mean to us in our individual roles? What does that mean to us in our collective roles within provincial government? I'd also like to acknowledge that Nova Scotia is the birthplace of African presence in this country, and we should be very proud of that. And so I say to you all, Ubuntu, I am because you are. A person is a person only because of other people. We're all connected in this space, and we invite you to enter into this dialogue in that spirit of interconnectedness. On behalf of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, and specifically our CEO and Director, Christine Hansen, who is unable to be here, as she is traveling in and will be here with us tonight, I wish to thank you all again for joining us. As Tracy already mentioned, we are here today because of the horrendous act on March 21st, 1960, when police opened fire and killed 69 African men, women, and children, injuring 300 others as they peacefully demonstrated against the apartheid pass laws in Sharpeville, South Africa. We are here today because it has been 50 years since the United Nations International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination was enforced in 1969 in response to this racist act. But we are also here today because racism, in its various forms, systemic, institutionalized, individual, and cultural, still exist, not only in faraway places like South Africa, not only through what I'll call the Trump factor infecting the United States of America and the world, but it has unfortunately been commonplace right here in our country and closer still in our province of Nova Scotia. I hold the position of Race Relations, Equity and Inclusion Manager, and the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission has such an office because of the Donald Marshall Jr. inquiry, which sought to correct traditions of systemic racism, which resulted in a Mi'kmaq man being wrongfully convicted in 1971 of killing an African Nova Scotian man and spending 11 years of his life imprisoned for a murder he did not commit. And we may say that Sharpeville and Donald Marshall Jr. and Viola Desmond's encounters happened a long time ago. But we would only need to open our social justice eyes to be aware that in 2019, there is still a need for all of us to join in the fight for, to advocate for, to take individual and collective responsibilities and actions towards the elimination of racial discrimination in all its forms today. So we are not there yet, which is what brings us here today. Today, we specifically turn our focus towards systemic racism, the policies, processes, and practices entrenched into our established institutions, organizations within our society, whose walls and the very foundation serve as barriers to African people, Indigenous people, racialized immigrants. And how do the inner workings of systemic discrimination, how do they impact upon racialized people? How do they discriminate against racialized people? So we look forward to this discussion today, unpacking systemic racism, our realities and responsibilities. So I welcomed you in the spirit of reconciliation and Ubuntu, and we consider this to be family time. So we don't often have this time to get together as provincial government employees, so we want you to feel at ease to ask questions. Please listen, as we would say to children. I hope you brought your listening ears. And please open your minds to really listen and to hear and to seek to understand what our panelists have to say to us today. So without further ado, I will introduce to you our esteemed and knowledgeable panel. First of all, Ariel Goff. Ariel Goff is a social entrepreneur, policy and communications advisor, and speaker. Originally from Upper Hammonds Plains, Ariel has helped some of Canada's most senior elected officials to engage the next generation of leaders in policy making and the political process. Her previous work experience includes the Nova Scotia Liberal Caucus Office, the Office of the Federal Minister of Families, Children, and Social Development, and most recently, the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. A recipient of the Nova Scotia Premier's Power of Positive Change Award, Ariel is deeply committed to inspiring her generation to use their gifts and talents to leave the world a better place. I introduce to you Ariel Goff. Would you mind standing so we can all see who you are? Thank you. Thank you very much, Ariel. Welcome. Secondly, Margot Hampton. Margot is an innovative, visionary, and resourceful individual offering 25 years of work experience of management in various fields including government, private sector, and community sectors. Margot has an extensive background in workforce training and development. Her passion is transformational leadership, building team effectiveness, mentorship, innovation capacity, change management, growth, and increased engagement. Margot is certified by the International Personnel Management Association as an accredited certified specialist in human resources, and she holds an Executive Master's of Business Administration degree from the University of Prince Edward Island. She currently sits as the co-chair for the African Canadian Women of Public Service, a mentor with BBI TD Mentorship Program, and is a member of the Diversity Roundtable within the provincial government, in addition to the Coalition on the Urban Aboriginal Strategy Committee. She has worked on various boards, including BBI, Imhotep's Legacy Academy, Kabakit Multi-Service Health Foundation Campaign, Black Educators Association, etc. Margot recently resided in Toronto, Ontario, and worked with the Canadian Aboriginal and Minority Supplier Council before returning to the provincial government. This organization, whose mission is to champion business relationships and economic growth of the Canadian supply chain through the inclusion of Aboriginal and minority business suppliers, is one that she enjoyed working with. Margot believes it is important to lead by example. Let's welcome Margot Hampton. Tom Henderson is a racially visible person of African descent who was born and raised in Montreal and has lived and worked in Nova Scotia for the past 25 years. Tom is currently a curriculum consultant in the African Canadian Services Division of the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development, where he contributes to the development, promotion, and delivery of programs, resources, and services for African Nova Scotian students. In his 16 years with the department, Tom has participated in intra-governmental partnerships and has served as a liaison between the department and community-based organizations. Before joining the department to serve the wider public, Tom taught English language arts and social studies in junior and senior high schools in Nova Scotia. Tom is committed to the principles of anti-racism, Afrocentricity, and social justice, and attempts to incorporate these principles in everything that he does as an educator. Let's welcome Tom Henderson. And Jude Gerard. Jude was born in Sheet Harbor, Nova Scotia, and is a member of the Millbrook First Nation. He has worked for several departments within the Nova Scotia Public Service, including education and early childhood education, communities, culture, and heritage, and is currently the Chief Diversity Officer of the Nova Scotia Apprenticeship Agency. He continues to sit on the Provincial Treaty Education Implementation Committee. He's the current chair of the El-New First Nation Employee Network, and he has been a speaker at national and international conferences on systemic oppression and racial identity. He was the first Canadian to be trained as a facilitator in Beyond Diversity 2, Courageous Conversations About Race, and he received an award of recognition from the Pacific Educational Group for his work in reducing the achievement gap for First Nation and African Canadian students. He was the first Mi'kmaq employee to be awarded the Nova Scotia Premier's Award of Excellence. Let's welcome Jude Gerard. We are exceptionally blessed to be sitting in the room and having the ability to listen to and learn from these esteemed panelists today. So we welcome you again, and we will hear from each of you, after which time I will provide you or request some answers to some specific questions from you, and we'll open the floor as well for the audience to ask you questions. And we can start maybe with Margot, and then we'll move on.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Maybe we can pull this up a little bit more. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the systems that we have in place with the provincial government and how the systemic racism affects those. Understanding the impacts of mitigating systemic racism through a diverse and inclusive strategy is a government's responsibility and obligation. The provincial government has identified that racialized communities in Nova Scotia live in greater isolation and experience overt racism when seeking employment and access to public services. Yet, they refrain from having a system that addresses these problems. So let's talk about the key initiatives government must implement if they want to increase innovation, change for social economics, and develop business opportunities nationally and globally. Today, racialized people in government internally are left out of the planning stages, the implementation stages, the reporting stages, and the evaluation stages. This is what happens when you don't have diverse leaders involved in positions where decisions are being made. Because of this, it's like, I'm going to break it down in a way to help you understand. It's like baking a cake. You keep using a French vanilla recipe, but you really want a marble cake. So unless you change the ingredients, you will continue to get French vanilla. Sprinkling a few chocolate chips on the top does not make a marble cake, unfortunately. So let's look what we really need to do with a diversity and inclusive strategy that needs to be dynamic, it needs to be inclusive, holistic, and yes, it's going to be complex. Why is this important? Because our problems are complex, our history is complex, and therefore our solutions will be complex. And that's a fact. If you're paying attention to other firms, organizations, or governments, and paying close attention to the needs of racialized people that are leading the way with these other firms and organizations, you will see that others will want to follow and not be far behind. Government is one of the largest employers in the province. They need and should be leading by example. We don't want a multitude of reports. We've already had that. We don't need more surveys. We've already had that. We know what the truth is. We are not reflective in the leadership positions. I was black yesterday, I'm black today, I'm still gonna be black tomorrow, I'm pretty sure of that. So consider me counted in. I don't need to be counted again. We need racialized people in positions of authority, and we need a plan. What do we need in that plan? Our plan needs to be very specific. It needs to have very specific targets, mandated expectations, clear goals, and serious change. We need measurable outcomes with accountability, measuring the positions that we have, reviewing the programs, evaluating performance of our leaders by our peers, our clients, our communities. Let them get involved and not only focus on awareness. Salary audits for those who have self-identified to ensure that those who are in the few leadership positions are being treated with equity. We need attainability, developing programs, resources, and delivering mechanisms that are attainable. We constantly build programs and services for racialized people without having racialized leaders at the table helping frame those programs and services and helping them implement them. We need applicability. Are the programs and services recommended capable of actually being applied? If we're not at the table and involved, then how do we know that those programs are actually applicable to those they are intended to serve? We need to know that they are appropriate for the situations, for the goal or the target you're trying to achieve. Or are we still too intimidated to address the real issues by cutting corners and saying we only have a certain amount of funds? Either we're in it or we're not. We're devoted or we're not. We need a plan that is time-based. Clear timelines. We have been waiting for the last 100 years. So quite frankly, to wait another 3 or 4 years for a diversity and inclusive strategy that is not meets these types of measurements and targets is not doable for racialized people within the government. Our realities today are this: we're overlooked, we're undervalued, we're underutilized, and we're unrecognized. Boy, are you missing out on top talent, ideas, creativity, and innovation, all because we look different. We're tired and we're exhausted. But all we're asking for is an opportunity to be a part of the province that has so much potential and the opportunity and growth to be the phenomenal province that we know it can be. Looking different doesn't solve every problem, but it solves a lot more problems than looking the same and doing the same. Thank you.
I guess I'll go next. I don't think there's a whole lot left to be said. First, Kesa, I want to thank you for your explanation of why we do a traditional welcome to the territory. That's something that's missed. I get called an awful lot to go to government departments, events, whether it's a conference, whether it's staff training or anything like that, to do a traditional welcome and welcome people to my territory. And sometimes it feels like tokenism. Actually, more often than not, it feels like tokenism. Today, it doesn't. So I want to thank you for that. Hearing you say that. The other thing that you mentioned was that this is our kitchen table, where we can feel free to have conversations. I find that the irony in that, because the kitchen table is where most of the stereotypes and biases in this province are born, around the kitchen tables. When we look at systemic oppression, that's where it's deeply embedded into society, is around our kitchen tables. And our kitchen tables are the hardest place for us to make a change. So I find that great that this is our kitchen table. So with that being said, if I say anything that offends you, I'm not apologizing. That's just how we're going to roll this conversation out. I also want to start by saying that I don't speak for all Mi'kmaq people. I do not speak for my children. I do not speak for my parents. I do not speak for my grandparents. I speak for me. So anything that I say here does not represent my community. It does not represent the Mi'kmaq Nation. It does not represent my employer. It represents me and my experiences. With that being said, I am going to get into this here. I know I only have a few minutes, but there's a couple points that you had mentioned. This is sort of like a sharing circle. When you're going around the circle, everybody's supposed to be really quiet, and you're listening to all the words that are being said, and you know exactly what you want to say, but then somebody says something and that sort of perks your interest. And then it continues on. Then when it gets to you, you have absolutely no idea what you're going to say. So I want to start by making sure that everybody recognizes that there's a difference between the definitions of guilt and responsibility. When we do this work, I think a lot of times the work gets stopped and, you know, we're talking about this age of Trumpism. We hit that wall that's created when guilt comes into play. There's a difference between guilt and responsibility. Guilt is what you feel for your own actions. Responsibility is what you take because of who you are as a person. So I'm hoping that when we leave and go forward today, that we won't have that feeling of guilt, because guilt does absolutely no good. We'll focus on that responsibility piece as we move forward. Today I wanted to briefly talk about the TRC calls to actions, but not quite how we've been talking about them since they were released in 2015. When they were released, about 5 years ago, it was approximately 5 years ago when the initial calls were actually released. And when that final report came out, I don't think anybody's read the final report because it's over 3,000 pages. But we focus on those couple pages of the 94 calls to action. And what they have done is created a checkbox mentality for us when it comes to relationships with Indigenous communities across this country. It's doing some good work, but if we want proof that it has become a checkbox, all we have to do is look at CBC. I checked today, actually before I came into the building, and they still have on their interactive website a checkbox for the TRC calls to action. And right now, as of today, as of yesterday, the CBC site says that 30 of the actions are not started, 35 are in progress with proposed activities, 19 are in progress and are moving along, and 10 are complete. If they're complete, that's a checkbox. So we don't need any more proof to say that that's what we're falling into when it comes to the calls to action. We're focusing on the wrong thing. And as government, we're focusing on the wrong thing. We're focusing on that checkbox mentality, and a checkbox does not change behavior. It does not change culture within a workplace. Instead, we need to focus on the principles around reconciliation. Because when you focus on the principles of something, that's where you start to see change. I'm only going to take a couple seconds here because I want to read these out. I think it's really important. Then I got a couple minutes just to talk about the stuff, because I don't think everybody knows what these principles are. And I feel it's all of our duty to understand exactly what it was when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission went in and actually spent 5 years interviewing thousands and thousands of survivors of the residential school system. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is the framework for reconciliation at all levels and across all sectors of Canadian society. First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people, as the original peoples of this country and as self-determining people, have treaty, constitutional, and human rights that must be recognized and respected. What that means is we're not stakeholders. We have treaty inherent rights in the work that's happening through government, through business, and through not-for-profit organizations. Reconciliation is a process of healing relationships that requires public truth sharing, apology, and commemoration that acknowledges and redresses past harms. Reconciliation requires constructive action on addressing the ongoing legacies of colonialism that have had destructive impacts on Aboriginal people's education, cultures, and languages, especially languages, health, and economic outcomes that exist between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. All Canadians as treaty people share responsibility for establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships. It's not a one-sided relationship. A one-sided relationship is looking in the mirror. Okay? Relationships are based on two or more individuals. The perspectives and understandings of Aboriginal elders and traditional knowledge keepers of ethics, concepts, and practices of reconciliation are vital to long-term reconciliation. Supporting Aboriginal people's cultural revitalization and integrating Indigenous knowledge systems, our oral histories, laws, protocols, and connection to the land into the reconciliation process are essential. We get stuck in doing a Western philosophy, a Western mentality, a one way of knowing. There are multiple ways of knowing, there's multiple ways of doing, and there's multiple ways of being. It doesn't say that the other ones are wrong, and we all have to conform to that one identity when it comes to knowledge. Reconciliation requires political will, joint leadership, trust building, accountability, and transparency, as well as substantial investment of resources. Reconciliation finally requires sustained public education and dialogue, including youth engagement about the history and legacy of residential schools, our treaties, our collective treaties. They're not just the Mi'kmaq treaties, they're not just Aboriginal treaties. Treaties, once again, are based on relationships, and they're signed by multiple parties, as well as the historical and contemporary contributions of Aboriginal people to Canadian society. So we focus on the checklist. And where does that get us? We do things just to do them. We don't question our actions behind what it is we're actually doing. I've done work with boards and agencies over the year, and one of the things that I found really interesting and quite disheartening recently was when a board asked me to work with a Aboriginal advisory group so that they can determine the best ways forward for reconciliation for the white board. No, we're not doing the hard work. Reconciliation, to me, it's if we continue on with this whole idea of the kitchen table, reconciliation is inviting all parties to the table. But when we get to the table, y'all take the food away. And then all of a sudden, the utensils are gone. And when we look down, the tablecloth has been stripped and thrown in the wash. And then finally, we're moved to a small table that's reserved for the kids in a patriarchal society, where we're expected to listen to the oppressor because the oppressor knows what's best for us. That's not reconciliation. Reconciliation is all gathering around the table, preparing the food together based on what the other's likes and dislikes are. You can't have reconciliation without relationships. Relationships begin when you listen to each other's stories. Reconciliation begins when you believe those stories. One of the things that I find that's very difficult for Indigenous people, Aboriginal people, whichever term you want to use, because we got to remember these are terms that aren't imposed, that we don't impose on ourselves. These are terms that are created by broader society for us. When we're asked to be at the table, sometimes we have to question, what's the purpose of us being there? Why are we being invited? What is the motive of the person inviting us to have us sit at the table to hear our voice? So that we can provide the knowledge, so that we can provide that figure of consultation, of working with. But then when we voice a concern, or we question the motives, or we question the policies, we're no longer invited around the table. We're seen as angry. We're seen as disgruntled. The one that I really like is we're seen as really passionate about the work. That's not passion, it's a lived experience. And when everybody can understand those lived experiences, I think we can move a little bit further. The other areas that I find really difficult for me, remember, I'm speaking about me. I'm not speaking about all Mi'kmaq people that are working in the public service. I'm not speaking about all Mi'kmaq people around Nova Scotia. When it comes to diversity, one of the things that I find really, really prevalent, and this actually goes really well with your marble cake, I don't look at it as marble cake. I kind of look at the fact that we do diversity really well in Nova Scotia. We do it really well. But sometimes I wonder how much we actually value it. When you do diversity, to me it's sort of like the Titanic. I don't use the marble cake, I use the Titanic. You know, we rearrange all those deck chairs to make the deck look really pretty, but we don't question the route that the boat's on because it's still sinking. When you do diversity, you rearrange the deck chairs to make our spaces and places look pretty. When you value diversity, you question and interrogate the spaces and places that we find ourselves in. We question and interrogate policies on how they affect some and they're a detriment to the others. And that's how we try to move forward, right? Through this whole reconciliation process. We actually have to look and question, what are some of the things that I'm doing? Am I doing this for me, or am I doing this because it's the right thing to do? And that whole thing speaks to allyship. I'm a firm believer in allies, but being an ally is not part of your identity. It's the actions you do. I donate to the Cancer Society. I haven't had cancer. I can't relate to that, but I make that donation. Right? It's about the actions. It's not about the identity piece. I'm an ally for the African Nova Scotia community. I'll never be black. I'll never have that experience. But it's my actions that speak to what that allyship is about. And that allyship is about the behind-the-scenes work. It's not looking for the glory. It's not the whole look at me, look at me, look at me, what I'm doing sort of thing. It's doing it for the right reasons. With that, I'll stop. Thank you.
First, I want to start off. Can everyone hear me? No. No? Closer? Awesome. I want to start off by thanking the Human Rights Commission and African Nova Scotian Affairs for having me and recognizing that young people may have something to say on this issue. I think oftentimes when we're asking the question, is everyone at the table, we often forget that there are younger people that need to be there as well. So thank you for that. And I also have to say that this room looks very different than what I thought it would look like. There are a lot of young people here, and I recognize a few faces, so I'm really glad that you came out to be part of this discussion, and I hope that you have some questions for the panel and hold us all accountable. So I'll start off by saying that working in government was not really a thought for me growing up. And when I thought of working in government, it was for older people, and I always heard talk of pensions, whatever that was. But it wasn't really something that I aspired to do. And it wasn't until that I got into government by happenstance, it wasn't deliberate, that's for sure, that I came to appreciate the role that the public service plays in bettering the lives of Nova Scotians every single day. And what shocked me the most when I started working with government was the responses and the reactions that I got from my peers. A lot of the times they would say, "You're working in government, why are you doing that?" Or, the government is corrupt, or they don't do anything anyway, so why would you want to work for them? And it was shocking because I felt like I was working every day to give back to my community. That's the reason why I got involved. But I understood that for a lot of the people that I grew up with, that simply wasn't the case, and that's simply not how they viewed government. And that made me realize that there are so many obstacles and barriers that young people, especially African Nova Scotian youth, have to overcome to even start thinking about a place in government, let alone finding their space when they get there. And I think to better understand those barriers and those obstacles, we have to start having conversations. So that's why conversations like this are so vitally important. And as I said at the beginning, working in government was not something that I thought about. And I know for many of the people that I grew up with and many African Nova Scotian youth, it's simply not something that they think about either. And I think that the easy answer may be, it's lack of awareness. They just don't know what's available in government. It's lack of exposure. They're just not exposed to the jobs and opportunities that are available. But I think that those are surface level answers. I think that we need to dig deeper to understand why young people, especially African Nova Scotian youth, aren't thinking about their place in government. And that could be a part of the larger conversation that we need to have about why young people in general are becoming disinterested in government, but it's even more so for African Nova Scotian youth. And I think a large part of that has to do with the social justice piece. I think my panelists, fellow panelists have spoken to this, but certainly as African Nova Scotian youth, we value the opportunity to give back to community. So we have to ask the question of why don't we see government as an adequate avenue to do that? I think the work that I've been able to do over the past few years have shown me personally that government is an avenue to give back to your community, but I've had many conversations with people my age who say, we've been talking about the same issues for years. We've been talking about the same issues around the achievement gap for African Nova Scotian learners. Why are we still talking about the same issues? Why are we still talking about the same issues around environmental racism? If government was an opportunity to make changes, why isn't that happening? And that is very discouraging to young people when years go by and there doesn't seem to be any adequate change. And I think that also goes back to the genuine distrust that many African Nova Scotian youth have of systems in general. We have to look at not only government, they're interacting with police, and we're having larger conversations about street checks. We're having larger conversations about other systems that we interact with every day that also are affected by systemic racism. I know for me, I think about an experience that I had with my younger brother. We were at the movie theater, and we were sitting there quietly watching a movie, and two movie theater employees came into the theater, and they singled out my brother and my cousin, and they told them to stand up, and they asked them for their tickets. And my cousin and my brother brought out their tickets, and then the two movie theater employees, they left the room. And something just didn't sit right with me about that experience. So I got up from my seat and I walked out, and I said to one of the younger ladies, she was about my age, I said, why did you come into the movie theater and ask my brother and my cousin for their tickets? She looked at me and she said, well, they looked suspicious. And I said, okay, well, what does suspicious look like? And she didn't have an answer. She said she needed to go get her manager. So those are interactions that young people and people of color in general, racialized groups are having every single day, not just with government, but in every single system and every environment. And those are experiences that stick with us. So when we're thinking about careers, number one, we may not want to deal with that, and we are likely to speak up. And then, as my fellow panelists have said, you're looked at as being a troublemaker. So those are just experiences that we may want to avoid. And lastly, I think we need to look at the systemic barriers that keep young people, especially African Nova Scotian youth, from the public service and keep them from finding their place when they are there. So we know that oftentimes to find jobs in the public service, it's about connections. Young people, especially African Nova Scotian youth, are starting out far behind their other colleagues. So to have connections in, higher places or connections with those who make hiring decisions is sometimes nearly impossible. So we need to look at how we are, providing mentorship opportunities, how higher managers or senior managers are involved in communities so that they can actually meet young people, and when they are making hiring decisions, that those young people are top of mind, because if you don't have connections, it is sometimes virtually impossible to get these jobs. And I know that I've benefited personally from the connections that I've managed to forge even before I got into the public service, but that was because it was deliberate on my part. But I know that a lot of young people don't have the opportunity to make those connections. And I also think we need to look at experience and qualifications. Again, because a lot of African Nova Scotian youth are coming from places where they weren't able to get the experience that we're looking for on job descriptions. How are we able to overcome that? How can we provide on-the-job training and experience? How can we provide that even earlier on? Maybe we're looking at junior high school, into high school, when they're looking at what they'd like to do after university. How are we forging partnerships and developing programs with community colleges and universities to help young people to start thinking about their place within government? Unless you're doing a political science degree, how do you know about the opportunities that are available to you? So those are the things that we need to start thinking about. And lastly, workplace environment. As I mentioned, although I don't speak for all young people, social justice and community service is a large reason for why a lot of young people choose the career paths that they do. So we go into law, we go into medicine because we want to make the world a better place. But at the same time, when there are injustices, we are going to speak out. So as a workplace, as a work environment, are we providing opportunities for young people when they do get there to make a significant difference? Are we valuing their voices, or are we stifling their voices? Because that is, again, another deterrent for young people to join the public service. I'll close by saying we can't afford to not get this right. I think we can't afford to push these issues aside, because we are going to need bright, young people, bright, young, diverse young people to take on the jobs of the future, especially in the public service. And to do that, we need to start looking at, number one, why aren't they thinking about jobs in the public service and in the provincial government? Why do we have this mistrust of systems, and how are we working to address those? And finally, how do we overcome the barriers of connections, experience, and qualifications, as well as improving our workplace environment so that it's conducive to the work that needs to be done, and so that we can recruit these bright young people, because this province doesn't survive without it. Thank you.
I guess I'm last. I just want to, if you could just take one of these and pass it on, thanks. I should hand these out. Yeah, could each person take a red flag? Okay, sure. So what I wanted to start with actually is first a thank you to both the Commission and to ANSA. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this. And I thank all of you. I think I really appreciate this opportunity to have this family discussion. I'm very proud to be a civil servant, and I'm very honored to participate in this discussion so that we can become collectively better civil servants. I noticed that my fellow panelists didn't really sort of touch on any definitions of racism, so very quickly, I know most of you know this, but very quickly, because I'm going to be focusing on a particular type of racism, systemic racism, I just want to make a quick little distinction between everyday sort of bigotry, prejudice, discrimination. You know, I was leaving the Department of Education, a guy rolled down his window and shouted the N-word at me. That's just like everyday kind of bigotry, hate, and so on. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about racism, which is that sort of, that bigotry, prejudice, discrimination, plus power. So I'll give you a quick example. One time on a business trip for government, I rented a nice car. When the officer pulled me over, and I was dressed exactly as I am right now, the first thing he said to me was, "You sure took a long time pulling over. How do I know you weren't throwing drugs out the window?" Our subsequent conversation changed. He was based on his beliefs, prejudice, power, whatever, plus power. That soon became a different sort of interaction. That became a dangerous interaction for me because he had the power of the gun, the billy club, imprisonment, a night in jail, right? So our interaction, he was exerting both prejudice and power in that moment. But that's not even what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is when that gets elevated to the level of systems. When systems themselves actually operate in a way that discriminates, creates barriers. And the thing about this specific type of systemic racism is that, and I don't know if you'll agree with me, is that well-intentioned, good, intelligent people can participate in systemically oppressive environments. Good, well-intentioned, intelligent people can make policies that are actually racist. And when a racist policy is implemented by government, it's an example of systemic racism. So that, I just wanted to have that sort of like base understanding. I gave each of you a flag. I'd like you all of us to think of ourselves as allies in this, in challenging racism, systemic racism. So whenever during my presentation, and it's kind of rigged, but whenever during my presentation, you hear me say something that, hey, wait a minute, you should raise your red flag. If you hear something like I say, I'll give an example. A committee was formed, community made recommendations to the minister, and the minister handpicked, members of the committee. Okay. Yes, raise your red flag when yes. So whenever I mention something that is problematic, can potentially be a space where systemic racism can enter. My premise is that, and I'm borrowing a little bit from Ann Bishop and her book, Beyond Token Change, Breaking the Cycle of Oppression in Institutions, where she argues that oppression can occur in the cracks in policies, practices, and procedures. Oppression, systemic racism can take place in who gets invited to the meeting, who's not invited, who's copied on that email, who's not copied, right? Who's sitting on the steering committee, who's not sitting on the steering committee, how's the steering committee created? All of those places are locations where, unless we're really deliberate about how we do things, systemic racism or other forms of oppression can enter into our thinking, into our decision-making, and into our policies. So I'm talking about policies, practices, and procedures. You can, in your own departments, you might think about strategies, initiatives, any kind of work that we do, we want to think about the process. So my focus is on the process. And what I'm going to do is give you a quick case study. I've been in the Department of Education for 16 years. So what I've done is I've actually created a fictional case study based on real things that have happened in the 16 years. So I'm not talking about a specific initiative or policy, and I'm not even talking about specific individuals, not this minister, that deputy, and so forth. I've sort of put them all together to create this, fake case study. But everything that I tell you is real. These are all real examples of things that have happened. So let's say there's a concern raised about wave caps. So the young black men often wear like a nylon covering on their head, right? So I used to wear one when I had hair. You just don't want to get grease on your pillow, or your hair is just too nappy in the morning. You put on a wave cap, or you're trying to style your hair and so on. It's just a wave cap, right? But let's say there's starting to be a public concern or outcry about these wave caps. And somebody writes a letter to the editor. Somebody comes in, and so we had a similar example. Parents come to the legislature, make comments on the floor of the legislature that they're concerned about their children. So red flags, thank you. They're concerned about their children being in, and you folks, oh, thank you. And they're concerned about their children being in class because their children are thinking, wow, are these gang members? Like, I don't feel safe, right? So you have these statements being made on the floor of the legislature. In response, a minister will say, I'm going to address this issue. This is a serious public concern. Red flags. This is a serious public concern. So we're going to establish a blue ribbon panel to look into this matter. Wow, the flags, my goodness. We're going to create a blue ribbon panel to look at this. So the minister appoints, a chair of the panel, and then, yes, and then community members make recommendations, and those recommendations are accepted or not accepted by the minister. This is true. This panel, one of the panels that was created, didn't have any African Nova Scotian representation. When that was raised with senior management, the response was, and we're family here, so right? The response was, well, the panel is just to collect information. They're not about making decisions. They're just about, launching the inquiry, right? So we have this blue ribbon panel that is collecting this information. Here's a true statistic. They had, to be fair, the survey was really well done. It had online components, phone-in components, letter-writing components. It had face-to-face meetings in church halls. Right across the street was one of the meetings, and so on. They had 18,785 responses. Of those 18,785 responses, 399 were African Nova Scotians. So, the minister says, thank you for all your responses, and creates a commission to look, council to look at this. And the council, I'm going to call it, thank you. They're given the job of addressing this new policy that's going to be created called the Provincial Orderly Operation of Public Schools Policy. Right? The Provincially Orderly Operation of Public Schools because that's a mouthful, we'll just call it POOP. So the minister calls for this POOP policy and creates a council. And the council is again created through submissions and so on. The orderly operations of public schools council, oops. And they're meeting. They're discussing, and they do have some representation from, they have students sitting on this oops. They have teachers, they have various representations, various people represented. But here's the thing. The oops meetings are chaired by the deputy minister, and a representative from the NSTU. The minutes of the OOPS Council meeting are created by a senior member of policy. Red flags. In any case, this council does its work and comes up with a draft. That draft is taken to what we used to call the school boards, now called the Regional Centers for Education. At a senior meeting of the directors, largely a group of older white males with a couple women, but no racially visible persons, they are reviewing the draft. This is true. They realize, they look around and say, hey, we're missing some voices here. So during the meeting, they walk out to African Canadian Service Division and they say, hey, Steve, Tom, could you guys come in here and review this policy? Thank you. So we say to black folk, I'm 54, Steve's in his 60s, we say, based on our understanding of the way policies work, our understanding of research, our lived experiences, we think that if you try to crack down on wave caps, that policy, unless it's applied to other groups and so on, that policy is going to disproportionately negatively affect students of African descent. They're going to be facing more suspensions, their attendance is going to go down, all this and all that. And the folks around the room disagree with us. So they decide, because they're a collection of folks, because decisions are not made by consensus, they're made simply by majorities, the poop policy goes ahead and is implemented. In the first year of the poop policy, we find out from our data that indeed black students are being suspended for wearing these wave caps in class. The response is, well, we'll have to study that some more. The response is, we're going to let that policy sit for a year, and then we're going to review it, and then we may change it. And the response is done verbally. That's a red flag. In the meantime, various groups work to present research, and they say, you know what, if we change this policy in this way, that way, or we eliminate it altogether, the research says that we will actually make our schools more safe and inclusive environments. The criticism is that, well, that research is from their states. There's no Canadian research that speaks to wave caps and so on. So Nova Scotia is different. Nova Scotia doesn't have the same problems that the States has. So we need to wait until we find Nova Scotian or Canadian research that supports the elimination of this poopy policy. I'll end with this last thought. Let's say the council is also presented with information about how legally we may be in trouble because this is a discriminatory policy and it actually might be challenged in court. And the response is that, well, we'll go with the policy, and then if somebody challenges us, then we'll deal with it then. So that is a mix of, and to this day, the poopy policy still exists. That is a mix of all different policies and strategies and so on that, so it's a collection of examples, but everything that I described was actually real that happened. And I'm describing it not to, again, I'm not talking, everybody who worked on these were good, well-intentioned, intelligent civil servants, but we ended up with a poopy policy. So I'll leave you with this last thought. Systemic racism can actually live, it grows like a fungus in all of those tiny little interactions. And unless we're very deliberate about thinking about how we form committees, who sits on the committees, who's listened to, how we make decisions. Is it by consensus? Is it by majority? Do we listen to the research? Do we dismiss it? Unless we really pay attention to all of that, we could actually unwittingly be participating in systemically racist policies. So thank you for your time.
What a kitchen talk this is today. I mean, it's real. We're talking about oops and poops and red flags and all around the kitchen table. Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you, Ariel. Thank you, Jude and Margot. So I was going to start with my questions, but I think it would be more appropriate for me to open the floor first to your questions. And Amelia is ready and waiting with a mic, so just slip your hand up and she will find you. Come on, don't be shy. There we go. Right there.
Hi, so I work at the Department of Education with Tom, so obviously much of that story resonated. And my question is, in that environment where we currently live, much of the power that we used to have has been lifted away from people who used to have influence at some tables. Myself included, I don't get invited to meetings anymore. I'm perceived as negative because I tend to be oppositional when some of those things are said. So, and the other part of that whole blue ribbon, everything, blah, 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 is that every time you raise an objection, you were told, well, the survey results, all the survey respondents said X. And you, as an intelligent person, you know that that's irrelevant. So my question is, what do we do? Sorry, and I'm not directing that at Tom specifically, but what do we do?
Oh, we're going to let Tom answer that.
Thank you for your question. Actually, I've thought about what do we do. I've been thinking about that for 16 years, right? And I'll be brief and then I'll turn it over to other folks. I think one thing that has been effective is when we have a policy that actually explicitly puts in a check or balance on how we develop policies. Not just the policy itself, but the process. So I have a copy of the 2002 racial equity policy. In that policy, it actually calls for a committee, an advisory group that looks at all policies that come out of our department and looks at them specifically around, are they equitable? Who benefits, who loses, and so forth. And I think that's one way, is having an internal process that is just fixed, it's built into the concrete, it doesn't change, you know, this minister, that deputy, and so on. It's just built into the way we do business. That's one. And then also, I think you need an external body, sort of like the Auditor General or a body like that, that sort of takes a high-level look at how we develop policies and the policies that come out of our work. And can, before the policy is implemented, that sort of external body that's not tied to the relationships and all these other dynamics that happen internally, they also will take a look and have the power to make recommendations for change before the policy goes live. So that's just a sort of a quick answer that solves systemic racism in government.
I just have something small to say, because I think Tom is certainly the expert on that. But I would say that based on my experience, it starts from the top. And the reason why I say that is because I've also had the opportunity to work on the political side. I've worked in the public service, but more of the political side of government. And I think when you have a leadership that values those voices, it's very hard for you to sit around a table and, again, always be that voice until there are repercussions to being that voice. But when you have political leaders especially, or senior leaders around the table who understand the importance of looking at policies from that perspective, it makes it a lot easier.
I think that's actually a really tough question, but it's an easy one at the same time. It all speaks to, and it goes right back to Tom's, what you were saying about being around the table. It goes back to being around the table, plain and simple, legitimately being around the table. Because if folks sitting around the table that are developing policy, if something doesn't affect them and it remains invisible to them, right? Plain and simple, it remains invisible to the individual if it doesn't have any effect on them whatsoever. When policy is being developed, I just spent the day yesterday actually going through, taking folks and walking through the entire apprenticeship system from when kids are little bitties and they're learning about what the trades are. All the way up into that post-journey where folks are out in the workplace and they're mentoring other people to become part of the skilled trades. And when we take a look through that entire process from the very beginning and ask ourselves a series of questions, by having diverse voices around the table, because all the same voice, think about a choir. If everybody's soprano, do you want to listen to it? You need to have those multiple voices in order to have innovation take place. So when you ask those questions, you know, what inequities exist in relation to what it is we're doing? What are those inequities? Is this a gender-neutral policy that we're putting in place, or is this going to adversely affect a specific gender? Who is impacted by the decisions that are going to be made through this policy? And taking a look through that from beginning to end, not just the policy itself, but things leading up to it, the rollout and the implications there and beyond. How are groups differently affected by this policy? Because not everybody's going to be affected the exact same way. And what social inequities are being identified with this? What is this affecting? When we start looking and questioning all these individual things, just for example, running through the entire apprenticeship system yesterday, one of the things that we sort of came up with is at the very beginning, when youth are learning about the trades, and I'm going to focus this specifically on gender, okay? Females, when they're first learning about the trades, are marginalized for many, many reasons. They're probably the first in their family to go into a skilled trade. They're seeing the whole difference between boys' jobs versus girls' jobs. And even when we get at the high school level, for a lot of females that are going into the trades doing O2 or any of these other programming, they're the one-offs that are in there. So they're facing harassment and sexism, and just at that level. Then when they move into pre-apprenticeship, when they go into learning about the trades itself, let's say at NSCC, I'll just use them as an example, what are they facing? They're facing the lack of mentors because there's nobody else. The instructors are pretty much all male. They're facing harassment, right, in that area. Then they go into apprenticeship training. They go into the workforce. They've got no mentors that are like them. They're facing harassment. They go into their post-journey after they're trying to find employment, after they get certified. What are they facing? They've got no mentors, and they're facing harassment. There's a common thread throughout the entire process, right? So when you start to look at these policies that are put in place and you start looking at them from multiple lenses and having individuals with expertise in those lenses, because we all can't have the expertise in every lens. That's a given, right? But when you have that expertise around, that diversity around the table, diversity breeds innovation. You cannot have it without it. You can start to find how these policies adversely affect people so that you can either put a stop to that policy, change that policy, or make it a policy that is not gonna affect one group.
I'll jump in with this, and I'll kind of structure it a little bit differently. What happens if we don't change the culture moving forward? If we don't, we need to understand a couple things. The highest population growth that's happening in Nova Scotia is with underrepresented groups. We have immigration individuals coming into the province and really want to be here in the province. We have less than 1% of the leadership teams in government from racialized groups, and that's where the decisions are being made. So if we don't change the core of what we're trying to do as a province, we will continue to fail. We've made great strides, there's no question, but we're just existing. We're not really gaining on the race. We will not ascertain the innovation, creativity, and the growth that the province needs to move forward. And this in turn affects your education system, your health system, your justice system, your business community system, and no one wants to come to a province that is stale and not embracing change. We have a responsibility and obligation to pave the way for the next generation coming up the line. And we need to make sure that we're doing this serious, we need to make sure that we're doing it right, and we need to make sure that we're dealing with the root causes of problems. When we look at something like the justice system, what is the root cause to all of the individuals who are Black or African, Nova Scotian, with the highest population in the justice system? What is the root cause that is putting them there? Is it the systems? Is it their community issues in the community that they need better support? What are the root causes? And we have to be willing to take that on and willing to deal with that if we are going to make change in this province.
Thank you very much, panelists. I see a hand in the back. Amelia?
Thank you very much. Thanks. My name is Karen. I'm the Deputy Minister of the Department of Justice. So I thank you for your comments,
Kitchen
Margo.
table, kitchen table.
Kitchen table. So, and thank you very much. I'm going to give you my question so you can think about it, and then a couple of comments while you're, that I'll make while you're pondering the question. But the question is this. What should government do to do a better job of communicating progress that is being made? Not to shine a light and take a bow, but because I know that when as individuals that we see progress being made, that we can then see where the more progress can be made. So I think it is incumbent on us to do a good job, a better job, and I'm asking you if you agree with me, of shining the light on progress that is being made. So I'll let you ponder that for a second. I'd just like to make a couple of comments, having listened to you all, and thank you very much. I'm going to take away from this my commitment not to have any more poop policies. I love a great acronym, and so when you were saying that, I said, oh yeah, I know where this is going, poop, and then you said it. And it resonated with me. And what we can do to ensure that our policies are reflective of where we want to go, and it's not just a bunch of air and words that mean nothing. I think that in terms of, I made a note here about when you were all talking. Jude, I do have, and we've worked together and called upon you, a commitment to actually value diversity and not just have a checklist. Margo, I haven't met you before. My colleague knows you and says you're good, and I've seen great examples of that this morning. I don't want, to have just another vanilla cake and hope it's going to be a marble cake, but to actually, do some actions. And in terms of Ariel, what we can do, a better job to attract more young people into government and to move forward on mentorship. So I just wanted to share, because I'm passionate about access to justice. I don't want to be the Deputy Minister of Agriculture. Okay, I'll put that right out there. My background has been within the justice system. I was head of Nova Scotia Legal Aid. I grew up as a white middle class. And then I went to work with Legal Aid, and I thought, geez, after a year, there's something going on here. Either there is, we've got overrepresentation, and all of my clients and everybody in the provincial court is poor, and that's just a big coincidence, or we're doing something wrong as a system. And that was in 1985. But there have been a couple of changes within government that I think it's important that we acknowledge here today. And just from who's sitting around me, on my left is my colleague Scott. And Scott is taking over a new position within justice. Give a wave, Scott. in terms of being an African Nova Scotian liaison officer, working within corrections to make better connections with the community. To my right is Curtis from ANSA and Communities, Culture and Heritage. In the Land Titles Initiative, actually making a difference in land titles from the 1963 legislation. And government committed and is putting that into action, working with the community. And Sammy, who's not making any eye contact with me over there, Sammy is also my colleague in corrections, and he got the Premier's Award of Excellence last year. He's tired of me talking about it, but you know, it's good to shine a highlight on that, because the way in which we are doing a better job recruiting African Nova Scotians and Indigenous people into corrections, and he's developing for all of the department in terms of African Nova Scotia cultural awareness training. And then finally, and I'll leave it at this, you know, I had a chance to say hi to my colleague in Labor and Advanced Education, Ava, give a wave there this morning. So Ava and the Department of Justice, we've been working with the Indigenous, Black and Mi'kmaq initiative at the law school in terms of the really valuing that, working closely with Professor Michelle Williams, and increased funding into that, and increased mentorship area that is happening now. So I'll get back. That's my public service announcement, just so you know that the Department of Justice, you know, really does value and not just a checklist and not just some chocolate chips on top of the cake. My right hand is Kathy Berliner, who's an Indigenous woman. She is my right hand. She's a strategic advisor. She reports to me, but I'm impatient. If I look at my senior management table, we don't have any African Nova Scotians at my senior management table. But my question, I'll turn it over to you, is what can we do, okay, to shine a better light on progress that is being made, because, or do you just disagree with me on that?
Please.
Thank you. And I actually want to do a shout out to Justice as well. Sam, sitting back in the corner, still not looking. I actually met him, it must have been 2007, maybe 2008, when you were at Waterville. And we started having conversations about getting a sweat into the facility for youth. So that was a while ago. My background is actually in justice as well. Prior to coming to the provincial government, I spent many years working in federal justice with Corrections Canada, and I'm also a former RCMP. So the justice piece is sort of front and foremost to me. And I'm glad to see all of that work happening in justice, because when you look at the calls to action, it's divided up into two sections. One section is around legacy, and the other one is around reconciliation. The legacy piece focuses on the intergenerational pieces caused through the trauma around residential schools, and 50% of those calls are all around the justice area. So that's amazing to see all of that work that's happening. As far as promoting our successes, I think we have to do two things. We have to be proud of those successes, but we also have to own up to our shortcomings at the same time. So when we're promoting those things, we have to. That's what we do. You know, we've done this here. This is amazing. And you know what? We still have to do this, and we're owning that. When we own the shortcomings, I think by doing that, it actually helps to promote the successes that we're seeing. Because we're not just sweeping stuff under the table and then pulling it out and getting at it when we have a chance, right? We're always keeping that on the front of the radar. Yeah, we've got these successes that are on the radar right now, but we've got these areas where we failed that are above the radar that we're working on now. And if we focus on our successes like that, I think they show more legitimacy to the work that we're actually doing.
I'm going to jump in a little bit, because that's what I like to do. I agree with you both that there's some phenomenal work that's going on, in particular in the Justice Department, as well as in a lot of other areas in government. And I think it's really important for us to recognize the work that is being done. But I agree totally with you, Jude, that we have to look at it from a balanced scorecard of this is what we've accomplished, but at the same time, this is what's still left outstanding. And these are all of the challenges that still remain. But I do think it's really important to recognize and to make it known some of the strides that we have accomplished and achieved, and I think those are really important. And when I see departments like community services trying to make strides, and I see justice trying to make strides, I think it's really critical for us to recognize those and continue to support them with the Public Service Commission on different things that they're doing. So I agree that we need to do that because we can't always be trying to deal with problems. We have to know that we've accomplished some good goals and that we have some work in progress and that we have a lot of champions in government. So I think it's really important for us to recognize that and to pay more attention to both sides of those, but owning the part that we have not accomplished to date. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is we talk often about, we've got this designated position and we've done this. One of the big challenges that we have is we have enough individuals in government and in the province that we shouldn't have to be designating positions. If we had a good practice and policy and process in place that if I was to apply for a management position, it shouldn't have to be a designated position. I should be looked at based on my qualification, my skills, my abilities, and my experience as all of my other colleagues. So while we have made great strides with designating positions, there's a bigger issue. And that's a part of the systemic racism part that Tom was talking about, that underlining piece of I should be based on my skills and qualifications and doing different types of audits. So for example, if you have a leadership team, you have a position open, watch that very closely. Are designated people applying for those positions? If they have, and they haven't received an interview or they have not received the position, why not? What are you missing, and what can you do about that to try to help increase that leadership representation?
I would say oftentimes we have to also reframe the definition of what success is. And especially when we think about our engagement with community and our engagement with employees, whether that's public service employees as well. So I think oftentimes in government, we work in a fishbowl. And we're working on policies very isolated from community and often isolated from other parts of our office, especially those who are affected by certain policies. So when we think about success, it may be a success to us. It may be a small win, but what does that look like? Does it make a tangible difference to those who are actually affected by certain policies? And I can give you tons of communication strategies for how to communicate certain successes, but at the end of the day, oftentimes you don't need to communicate if it's an effective policy, and if it's making a real and tangible difference in someone's life. So that's what I would say.
Thank you very much. And our time, oh, go ahead, Tom.
Sorry. Actually, thank you. I just, what the sister said, but I'd also like to add something I learned recently, and it's just very brief, from Carolyn Knockwood, who is the new executive director of Mi'kmaq Services at the department. And she's talking about truth and reconciliation, and she made the point, it's truth and reconciliation. It's truth and then reconciliation. And I think, thank you, Deputy, for your question about celebrating successes. I think before we get to that point, we have to really acknowledge the government's role in inequities, oppression through history. Before that happens, I'm not really in a celebratory mood. So I think truth must come first. And we often hear folks say there is more to be done. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about naming the things that have been done. So the land claims, it's beautiful to see movement on the land claims. But do people really know why that is so 400 years later? Let's name what the government did or did not do, right? Then we can celebrate if the land claims are settled. So it's just that truth and then reconciliation.
Thank you very much. I know we haven't talked a whole lot about, we haven't named privilege. We've been talking about that privilege and the importance of us acknowledging our privilege and how we benefit from the privileges that we have, and how that impacts upon systemic racism as well within our systems. I see your hand, but this I have to end. I have to close up. We will have an opportunity to meet with our panelists at the end, and I wanted to end with this particular question. And it's actually a quote. Tom actually sent me an article that was written by the former president of Dalhousie University, Richard Florazon, and Senator Bernard. And there's a quote by them that says, "Racism is more prevalent than racist." And you've all spoken to that as well in your talks. And the Supreme Court of Canada says that systemic racism is more widespread than overt racism. And it's important that we understand the differences as we've been speaking about earlier today as well. So we often hear, comments, so systemic racism, it's a thing. Is it real? Is that real? Is it real, or is it a figment of our imaginations? Is it a cop-out? Is it a lazy way out? Or some other derogatory ideology? So how do we respond to folks who are in denial about systemic racism? How do we get beyond the, "but I'm not racist" line in our discussion, and then action against systemic racism?
Wow. That's a loaded question. I think, actually, it's a loaded question, but it's okay, here. One of the biggest problems, one of the biggest barriers we have when we talk about race and racial ideology and talking about racism is the fact that we don't talk about the same thing. We always talk about two different things when we engage in the conversation. Folks that are non-racialized, I'm just going to use that term for now, when they talk about race, they talk about the overt racism, like you said. It's, "Oh, I'm not a racist, but I got this uncle, who, at Christmas time when we're gathered around the table, none of the kids can be near him because of the stuff he says," right? It's that overt racism, "I'm not a racist." And that's where we start losing the conversation. When folks that are from marginalized communities or racialized communities talk about race and racial ideology, they're talking about the systemic pieces. They're talking about the fact that if my name on my resume is Brooks or Crawley, not only is it not going to make it to the top of the pile, it's probably going to end up in the garbage. Right? So we talk about apples and oranges when we talk about race, when we get together. So what we have to do is we actually have to all agree on that working definition of race and what that conversation is going to be like so that we can actually start talking about the proper things. Because until then, I'm talking about sailboats and somebody else is talking about ATVs. It doesn't go hand in hand. You can't have that conversation.
Anyone else?
I would say that we do a really good job in government of, Jesus, Mike's far back. We do a good job in government of really trying to help employees understand our core values with a respectful workplace. And a part of understanding that is when we talk about posters of what is the definition of health and well-being, and we talk about mental illness. We have no problem putting up a poster saying what mental illness is. We need to put up posters to help people understand what racism is and help them understand how to identify it and how to do their own internal self-check of, "Oh, I read that poster. Let me double-check my self-beliefs and my values and within my own self internally," and it always be a constant reminder of this is what's important to us. We're calling it out, we're identifying it, and we want it to be well known as to what this is and what the government will not tolerate as part of its culture. But unless we own it, it will never come to fruition.
Thank you, Margaret.
Very briefly, thank you. It's a really challenging question. This is just sort of off the top of my head, but I think Nova Scotians, I've been here 25 years, as it was are good people. And I think tapping into that notion of empathy and understanding, not sympathy, but empathy. And I think starting the conversation through, we're talking today about race, systemic racism, but there are so many different forms of oppression. And tapping into something that might resonate with somebody, talking about the struggle for women's rights, the ongoing struggle for women's rights, might be an entry point for folks to understand that some of those same mechanisms are the mechanisms that oppress, racially visible people, let's say. So that would be just off the top of my head, that notion of tapping into an existing understanding around oppression, because we all, have, based on age, youth, sexual orientation, class, all those kinds of things, we've, in different ways, to different degrees, have experienced some form of oppression, and likely some form of systemic oppression, right? So maybe tapping into that through kitchen table conversations, drawing out empathetic understanding of my situation so that you can become an ally in supporting me, just as I should become an ally in supporting the oppression that you may be facing.
Thank you.
I would say that we have to recognize that this is an uncomfortable conversation for most people. I know for myself, I've not thought a lot about systemic racism until recently because it's one of those topics that I just wanted to ignore. If I worked hard enough, then maybe I'll get further. And that was very naive of me until I started having certain experiences myself. But I think once we understand that this is uncomfortable for most people, we're all here today because we want to have the conversation. But outside of these walls, it's uncomfortable for people. And I think one of my favorite people to listen to on this topic is Melody Hobson. She's an American investor. She talks about race and racial discrimination being one of the third rails that we just don't talk about. You have politics, religion, and then it's race. So how do we start to get more comfortable? And she also says being color brave instead of color blind. So a lot of the times when people say, I don't see color, well, that means you don't see me. That means you don't see my experience. I'm not saying that I want to be treated differently, but I want you to recognize that because of my history, because of the way that I look, I am at a significant disadvantage. So simply starting by recognizing that you need to see color. It's not about not seeing the color of my skin, because that's what has affected my experience today. So being color brave, I would say, would be mine.
Thank you.
I thought.
Any other comments? Well, thank you very much to all of you, to our panelists today. I think we're going to have to roll out of this room because we've eaten so much at this kitchen table. We are stuffed. We have a lot of nutritious food on which we can feed our thoughts for the days and months and years to come. And I just ask you to consider how we do the hard work of bridging the gap between our values as Nova Scotians, as provincial government employees, within your individual roles, as individuals and collectively within our departments. How do we do the difficult work of bridging the gap between our values? So what we say we value, what we say we believe, and the realities. Because when we think long and hard about that and we put that into action, that's when I believe we'll be seeing some changes within our systems that positively impact upon racialized people, African Nova Scotians, Indigenous people within our province, within our provincial government. And I long to see the day when we won't be able to count and name the racialized people that we have working with us. And I think that too might be an indication of some success. And maybe we'll have a party then, Tom. All right. So thank you very much. And I'll call Tracy to extend some formal thanks to our panelists. And thank you, audience, as well. I got so involved in the conversation, I lost track of my notes. I don't know where they are. So I guess, but I do want to thank everybody for attending today. I know we are just a tad bit over time, but I think that you'll get the importance of this conversation and why we're having it. So on behalf of the Human Rights Commission and African Nova Scotian Affairs, Margot, Jude, Ariel, and Tom, thank you so much. And we just have a token of our appreciation for your efforts here today. Thank you.